Hello, this is the 54th lecture on Revelation and World History. We have completed chapters 1 through 6 of Revelation and World History. We have completed the first half of the 12-chapter lecture and are now entering the second half. We have covered several crucial topics in the interpretation of the book of Revelation. We have discovered the true identity of the two beasts that appear in Revelation chapter 13, the seven-headed beast. And we have come to know who the beast with two horns like a lamb is, the one corresponding to 666. We also found a community of 144,000 people. We have also historically verified the relationship between Gog and Magog and Babylon. We are now examining another important topic, the Battle of Armageddon. In this lecture, we will explore the disastrous war and the influx of gold, silver, and clothing. Revelation and World History, Chapter 7, Section 6. A devastating war and the influx of gold, silver, and clothing. Let's examine Zechariah chapter 14. This is the plague the Lord will bring on all the nations who fought against Jerusalem. Their flesh will rot away while they stand on their feet. Their eyes will rot away in their sockets, and their tongues will rot away in their mouths. On that day, the Lord will cause a great uproar among them. They will seize each other's hand, and raise their hand against each other. Judah will also fight at Jerusalem. Then the treasures of the surrounding nations will be gathered, gold, silver, and clothing, in great abundance. This will be the same plague on the horses, mules, camels, donkeys, and all the livestock in the camps. Zechariah chapter 14 verses 12 to 15. The Korean War was a more brutal war than any other. The US B-29 fleet, known as Flying Fortresses, indiscriminately dropped bombs. The entire country was reduced to ashes by this so-called carpet bombing. The following is a scene from the war records of Jinju, South Gyeongsang Province, South Korea. The damage to Jinju City was as severe as any other city in the country. A massive bombing campaign by the U.S. Air Force destroyed every government office, factory, and home in the city. As a result, it became a pile of ashes that was unknown. Except for the outskirts, the entire city was burned and destroyed. The reason Jinju City was reduced to rubble within days of the bombing was because of the large number of Japanese-style wooden buildings built during the Japanese colonial period. The residential areas were also home to many thatched roof houses. And, when incendiary bombs or bombs were dropped, the resulting flames were carried by the wind, creating a sea of fire. Furthermore, when napalm exploded, the deadly heat engulfed the area, engulfing even shelters. As a result, all living things were instantly killed. We referred to Kim Kyung-yun's People and War Memory. In this way, not only people, but also animals were not spared from the ravages of war. Zechariah chapter 14 verse 15. One person testified, a cow was dragged out of its home, and its intestines were exposed after being hit by a bullet. Furthermore, livestock from farms, including chickens, dogs, pigs, and cows, were conscripted and provided as food for the soldiers. We referred to Kim Kyung-yun's People and War Memory. Also, during the Korean War, the country was divided into South and North, left and right ideologies. And, the massacres committed by both sides were very brutal. The retreating People's Army, running out of ammunition, stabbed right-wing figures to death with pickaxes and shovels. And, even doused detention cells with gasoline and set them ablaze. After the People's Army passed, those suspected of being collaborators were subjected to harsh retaliation and punishment. unarmed civilians often resorted to brutal retaliation, inflicting brutal wounds on their opponents with spears, shovels, pickaxes, axes, and stones. The most brutal methods of violence and massacre were employed, including driving pine stakes as long as a foot into the stomachs of the dead. Things unthinkable even to animals were committed. Witnesses testify that the perpetrators had no sense of humanity, let alone a sense of fellow countrymen. We referred to Kim Dong-chun's War and Society. There were also organized massacres carried out in the name of operations. A prime example is the civilian massacre in Nogun-ri, Yeongdong County, perpetrated by the U.S. military. In particular, the bombing of Iksan City by a U.S. Air Force B-29 on July 11, 1950, occurred just days after the outbreak of the war. This bombing occurred in a time when the civilian population had not yet felt the impact of the war. Regarding this, Joseph Goodin stated, "The North Korean People's Army's tactics of using civilians as shields led our soldiers to engage in extremely barbaric acts." He also pointed out that they scorched villages where they suspected the enemy was hiding, and opened fire on refugees suspected to contain North Korean soldiers. Meanwhile, the South Korean military also committed the Kuchong massacre. Around 1,500 civilians were killed in the Scorched Earth operation of the 9th Regiment of the South Korean Army in the massacre. On the eastern side of Mount Jiri in South Gyeongsang Province, innocent civilians were brutally massacred on the mere suspicion that they might aid communist guerrillas. We referred to Kim Dong-chun's War and Society. Christians were also not spared from the massacres caused by ideological conflict between the left and right. In the summer of 1950, many missionaries and Korean church workers, who had not fled but remained in their mission, were arrested and abducted by the North Korean People's Army. Also, at the Yawil Church and Yeomsan Church in Yeonkwang-gun, and the Byongchon Church in Nonsan, dozens of Christians were massacred by leftists. Sinchon in Hwanghae Province suffered the largest number of massacres during the war. Anti-communists and communists, including Christians, committed massacres, killing each other as the tide of war turned. We referred to the History of Korean Christianity of the Korean Christian History Association. Meanwhile, infectious diseases were rampant across such a wide area that it was suspected that germ warfare was being carried out by the U.S. military. Zechariah chapter 14 verse 12. We referred to Park Tae-gyun's Korean War. Thus, the Korean War was a brutal war without parallel in world history. At that time, the treasures of the nations around will be gathered together, gold, silver, and clothing, in great abundance. Zechariah chapter 14 verse 14. In 1954, MacArthur said at a seminar, "Korea has saved us." Cummings pointed out that, if the New Deal was the catalyst for America's first national revival in this century, the Korean War was the catalyst for its second. Meanwhile, former Japanese Prime Minister Shigeru Yoshida also called the Korean War a gift from God. Japan's post-war revival was possible because of the gift of the Korean War. We referred to Kim Dong-chun's War and Society. Although Japan was defeated in the Pacific War, the Korean Peninsula faced the tragic reality of division into North and South as a result of the Japanese colonial period. However, Japan, a war criminal nation, was able to rebuild its economy, which had been devastated by the war, thanks to the Korean War special effects. The Korean Peninsula was divided due to Japan's invasion, which led to the Korean War. The text in Zechariah chapter 14 verse 14 says that, because of the war, gold and silver treasures will come to Israel from foreign nations. However, this does not refer to spoils of war. It refers to the fact that a large amount of aid goods arrived in war-torn Korea. It is important to note that clothes will be gathered in great abundance. American aid came in the form of goods, not cash. Once a certain amount of aid was determined, goods equivalent to that amount were purchased and delivered to the recipient country. Therefore, the United States implemented a unique policy called Buy American. In other words, by purchasing aid goods as American-made products, they benefited American manufacturers, whose exports were disrupted by the aid. The Buy American policy was not always followed in the case of aid to Korea. Japanese goods were also purchased through public bidding to aid the Japanese economy. The Korean government sold aid goods to the public and used the proceeds for its budget. In the 1950s, more than 40% of total government revenues were covered by American aid. We referred to Park Tae-gyun's The Korean War. Notably, clothing was a significant component of the relief goods received at that time. Immediately following liberation from Japanese colonial rule in 1945, amidst material shortages, government offices distributed U.S. military relief supplies, such as uniforms and boots, acquired from the U.S. military government in Korea. Sometimes, dyeing was used to distinguish between rationed and military items. We referred to Go-bu Jaws, Our Life 100 Years, clothing. During the Korean War, large quantities of relief, supplies and uniforms were also distributed. Many people hurriedly fled, packing only emergency food and basic clothing in bundles. For these refugees, clothing, along with food, was the most essential item to survive the harsh winter cold. Even Rev. Harold Volkel, who came to Korea as a U.S. military chaplain, participated in the Refugee Relief Project. Large quantities of food and clothing were transported by car and distributed to the starving and destitute residents. We referred to Kim Kwang-soo's History of North Korean Christianity. UNICEF and others sent relief supplies, including used clothing, to aid in the reconstruction and recovery of South Korea, which had been devastated by the war. In 1954, 3,000 tons of used clothing from the Danish Red Cross arrived in Busan and were distributed to refugees. UNICEF also sent 40,000 blankets and 500 bags of clothing. These were called aid supplies or relief goods, and the largest amount was clothing. We referred to Go-bu Jaws, Our Life 100 Years, clothes. There was a time around the Korean War when clothing flowed into the Korean Peninsula in particularly large quantities. It wasn't spoils of war. It was a dark time when South Korea, devastated by war, and one of the world's poorest countries, barely managed to survive on relief supplies from wealthier countries. Not only South Korea, but also North Korea received significant economic aid from the Soviet Union and China. Kim Il-sung signed the North Korea-Soviet Economic and Technical Assistance Agreement during his visit to the Soviet Union from September 1 to 29, 1953. The agreement called for the Soviet Union to lend North Korea 1 billion rubles, or $250 million at the time, over 2 years. It also included a 50% reduction in North Korea's debt to the Soviet Union. In addition, the North Korea-China Economic and Cultural Cooperation Agreement was concluded during a visit to China from November 10 to 27, 1953. The agreement called for China to lend North Korea 8 trillion yuan, or $320 million at the time, in goods over 4 years. It also included the forgiveness of all North Korean debts to China. Aid also came from several Eastern European countries, and even impoverished Mongolia. We referred to Kim Hak-jun's 50 Years of North Korea History. In this way, both South and North Korea received war supplies from around the world, both from the free world and the communist bloc, before and after the Korean War. And a massive influx of aid funds for post-war economic support flowed into the Korean Peninsula. If the words of Zechariah chapter 14 verse 14 apply to the Korean Peninsula, it doesn't mean that there will be abundant spoils of war, such as gold, silver, treasures, and clothing. It can be understood as a large amount of aid goods will arrive to rebuild the war-torn Korean Peninsula. The word Armageddon appears in Revelation chapter 16 verse 16. The word Armageddon refers to Mount Megiddo or the hill of Megiddo. Zechariah chapter 12 verse 11 describes the mourning in the valley of Megiddo. This passage describes a war in which a coalition of nations from around the world attacks a single nation, Israel. Therefore, looking for a war in which a world coalition attacks a country is a shortcut to getting closer to the reality of the War of Armageddon. It is the Korean War. In the next lecture, we will examine Chapter 7, Section 7, and Section 8, the consequences of the war in Revelation and world history. It was the Bible History School. If you subscribe and set up notifications, you can continue listening to the lectures on Revelation and world history.